Hey gang, Kai here from Exped, and I've got our Thunder backpack. And in this video we want to talk about the anatomy of the suspension system and how we fit the pack's anatomy, to your torso length. So we're going to break this up into two parts. First, we'll talk about the anatomy. Secondly, we'll fit it. So let's talk about the anatomy. The best place to start is the hip belt and that important structure where the load is transferred so that you can carry load on that bony structure. I should say that Thunder is available in both 50 and 70 liter versions, and men's and women's in each of those. I've got the women's pack here and the men's here. So the hip belt is different for men and women, and mostly that comes into the length of the hip belt, shorter in the women's, and the women's is cut so that it's more conically shaped. The men's is more upright and a little bit longer around. Another very important part of the hip belt is the foam structure. It's a dual density foam, so it's a stiffer, stouter foam on the outside for weight transfer to the hips, from the frame to the hips, and then a softer, more moldable foam with a stretch fabric on the inside. So the pack actually becomes more comfortable after 4 or 5 usages and some weight transfer to the hips than it was originally. So it tends to custom mold to your hips. So that's the hip structure itself, the foam structure. One of the important little details is the load stabilizer straps here on each side, and we'll talk about their usage in a moment, but it goes from the lower part of the pack body to the hip belt. Let's move up, and you've got the T-Rex frame, and we call it the T-Rex frame because there's a central aluminum stay with an upper bar, and that forms the T in T-Rex. I like to call it T-Rex because it's quite a tenacious frame system. It'll deal with very heavy loads, surprisingly heavy loads for the weight of the pack, but it's also pretty light on its feet. So the upper T is where the load lifter straps that come off the top of the shoulder straps attach to structure, and that allows load stabilization, and you can change the shape of the shoulder strap ever so slightly by using those load lifters. And last is the harness itself, and that's made up of shoulder straps. The difference between men's and women's is in length and in the angle of the shoulder straps. We've also built in a scapula pad here, so there's padding between your shoulder blades and the load that you're carrying. Another important component of the suspension system here in the harness is the sternum strap. And the sternum strap is adjustable up and down so you can find the right position. And that helps when especially when you're scrambling or climbing or using trekking poles or grabbing roots on a steep trail. You're moving and the shoulder straps won't have a tendency to come off your shoulders. So it helps to stabilize the harness system. So that's the basic anatomy of the T-Rex frame. Now let's move to, as I say, matching that anatomy to your anatomy. The guts really of the adjustment to fit you is in how we position the shoulder straps relative to the hip belt. What we're trying to do is match your torso length, and I'm going to use myself as a reference point here, starting at the hip belt, and roughly in men it typically goes pretty much at the belt line here. What you're trying to do is get the top of your iliac crest to be about halfway up in the hip belt or thereabouts, and that matches up really well with the bones here in your lower back and your pelvis. It's platforms onto which you can put load, so it's a natural place for you to put a hip belt. So we start with that as a base. Then we need to position the harness so that the shoulder straps end up in a very smooth arc in contact with your shoulders right to the attachment point at the pack. So what that involves is the need to have an adjustable length here. And T-Rex, this single aluminum stay, does that beautifully. The scapula pad simply slides along the length of that single aluminum stay until you find the proper length to match your torso. How we do that really begins here. We can pull back the lumbar pad, which exposes a very important little detail. The T-Rex frame terminates, as I said, right here in this stout foam. So the weight is transferred directly to the hip belt. And an additional benefit to having the single aluminum stay is that the hips can move independently. So as you're walking down the trail, you get a little bit of hip motion. That allows the hip belt to match that. You can see that there's a strap that runs from the hip belt, this guy right here, with this buckle, to the scapula pad. And that, by loosening up that strap, I can adjust the length from short to long, and we actually have little reference points, long, medium, short. For my torso length, I happen to know that I slide it down until the lower part of the M matches up with this little black line right here. And what I'd suggest is, on your pack, you take an indelible ink pen and put the mark right there. So if you lend it to a friend, they have a different torso, and they return it longer or shorter, you can go right back to your fit. So once I've positioned that just where I want it for my torso length, then I snug it up, put the excess back underneath the lumbar pad, close the lumbar pad Velcro, and we now have a pack that's going to fit my torso. So let's put the pack on and see what that looks like on me. Now, we don't have any weight in this guy, but for you at home, I suggest you put 25 or 35 pounds in the pack so that it wants to sit down on your hips properly and not kind of climb up on your back. A little detail here on the hip belt. We've got this dual style of tightening so that you're pulling inward rather than pulling outward. You can really crank it down. When you're carrying heavy loads, it's important to get that hip belt nice and snug so it's not sliding down. So you get that base, then snug up the shoulder straps. And you can see that I've got a nice smooth shoulder strap going all the way over. And then, and only then, once you've gotten shoulder straps and hip belt position, you can use the stabilizing straps down here, which pulls the pack body in a little bit and helps stabilize it down there. You can also do that with the upper load lifters here. And finally, here with the sternum strap. And you are locked and loaded and ready to go just about anywhere. Skiing, mountaineering, scrambling. It's very sturdy, very, very comfortable on the body. One last thing about fit that is a pet peeve of mine, I want to make sure you understand it. People tend to pull on these straps. They take the pack off, they put it back on, they pull it tight again, and pretty soon it's looking like that, and it's pulling your shoulders back, and they tend to do the same thing over and over again, and pretty soon the pack feels terrible. But just like your shoes, you want to untie your shoes each time you take them off so that when you put them on, you mold it to yourself. So here's what you want to do when you take the pack off. Loosen those straps all the way up so that when you start, you're not fighting that extra tension. So that's Thunder, and that is fitting Thunder. Take a look at some of our other videos about Thunder. You'll see a few others. See you on the trail. Be comfortable.